Hello, hypothetical audience, and welcome to some hazy cosmic jive. I'm JJNW'S Ghost, and for today's jive, I wanted to go back to 1998 and talk about a show called Experiments Lain. Now, I don't remember when I was first introduced to Lain. I'd estimate probably about 7 or 8 years ago. I was aware of its reputation as a cyberpunk anime with various different gosh, I sound like Charles Barkley, with various different interpretations as to both its themes and its overall plot. I was mostly interested in it because it had the same head writer as Digimon Tamers. Now, a far cry from Digimon Adventure, Tamers starts innocent enough, with an uncomfortable moment here or there before devolving into a full-on horror show for its final arc. I remember loving that as a kid, and I did rewatch it. I believe it was last year, the year before, with Clay, and it still holds up really well. Now, I watched Lain when I was first aware of it, and it didn't do much for me. I do remember feeling uncomfortable when I would walk near a power line and, I would hear that telltale hum. But that's one of the only things I took from the show, aside from Let's All Love Lain and the opening, which is a certified banger. But a couple weeks ago, a few friends of mine started watching Lain, and their conversations and enthusiasm for it convinced me to give it a rewatch. And, of course, I wanted to talk about my experience. So what I decided to do is take notes for every episode while I'm watching them about what sticks out to me. And then I want to make a short video just about each individual episode and my experience with it. I want to go over things like the basic plot, if there's any particular shots that really stood out to me, and what are the major themes that I'm picking up on from each individual episode and how they contribute to the larger themes of the whole narrative. So, without further ado, let's log in to Experiments Lain. Layer 03, Psyche. The first few minutes of this episode are great. There's mentions of someone called Lain of the Wired, further cementing that Lain has a more active presence online than she does in reality. Later in the episode, there's another person she meets who knows her more for assertive personality, reinforcing that this is a recurring idea. Lain is interviewed by the police and they call her house, but no one answers the call, neither her parents or her sister, and we see that the house is completely empty. Her friend Alice is staying with her at the police station, and the entire time, all Lain can say is just Alice's name. The vibe I get is that while Lain doesn't care much for her other friends, Alice is someone that is important to her. And it may end up being something more than friendship, which I feel like was something that was explored in some of the later episodes, but I don't 100% remember. But ultimately, Alice's parents come and pick her up, so she has to leave Lain behind, reinforcing how lonely Lain's life is outside of the Wired. We then get another great scene when Lain returns home. The house is empty with no one to welcome her aside from her computer. There are these great shots of her stuffed animals just sitting on her shelf, and it reminded me a lot of Madoka, particularly the scenes when Kyubey is explaining to her the history of the incubators and their relationship with magical girls. I know the shots from Madoka with the empty chairs were inspired by Bokurano, so it really wouldn't surprise me if the shots with just the stuffed animals were taken from Lain. And the score in this scene is something that really stuck out to me. It's mostly this lonely piano with, these occasional strings to kind of back it up. It's really ambient and made the whole scene feel creepy, even though nothing was really happening. And that is something that the show excels at. It is so good at creating atmosphere about the real world being very lonely and unwelcoming. And like I said, the only thing to greet her when she got home was her computer, was the Wired. And I just really liked that little touch. I feel like it's also worth noting that this is one of the only scenes in the show that I noticed is really about that sense of loneliness, where the color white wasn't used. Instead, the main colors were blue and black. Now, a bit later, when she's on the train going to school, Lane starts hearing voices. She's told that she's not alone, it's better to treat to the Wired than to stay in reality. And the voice ends by asking her, who is Lane? It should give her something to ponder. Now, Lane ends up finding a letter in her school locker with an object inside. She asks her dad what it is, but he doesn't seem to know. She asks him again, a bit more forcefully, but he still doesn't know. And I really liked this touch. We've seen her dad thus far has an established track record of doing what Lane tells him to do. Asks for a computer, she gets it. She tells him to set it up now, he does it. So it only makes sense that, Lane would kind of be aware of this, and when at first he's like, oh, no, I don't know anything, to press her luck and make sure that he doesn't know anything. So that she ends up doing some more digging, and she learns that this object is something called a psyche, which gives her more, access, or her online presence now is a lot stronger. The last few minutes of the episode are with her sister, Mika. She notices these men in black scoping out the house. She tells her parents about it, but the parents don't listen. The mom in particular is very rude and distant to both of her daughters, which is just another way the show is showing how, kind of lonely reality is. Even the people that are supposed to be close to you just aren't. And the episode ends with Lane starting to upgrade her computer. I think this episode does do a really good job of expanding on the loneliness of reality compared to what can be offered inside the Wired. And then the scene inside her empty house is one of my favorite in the series thus far. I still think my favorite moment is when she first, leaves her house and you get that, the shot of the color white and such. But this was easily, my second favorite scene, and I think so far it is my favorite episode. Layer 04, Religion. This is an episode about the Wired bleeding into reality, which is something we've seen as early as the first episode, with those, kind of weird, shadowy blobs surrounding Lane as she walks to school. It seems to be just, this is the Wired. It's kind of bubbling under the surface. We see that teens are playing this video game in the Wired. It seems like it's kind of like Doom, but the visuals are still visible when they're in reality. In addition to that, the games are being mixed with another game that's played by small children that's just a regular game of hide and seek. It leads to a weird moment. It leads to a couple weird moments. There's this one where there's this ghostly visage of Lane who's trying to talk to this guy who seems like he is in reality. And then this guy loads an invisible gun, and I think he killed a kid with it because he thought the kid was a monster from the game trying to chase it. We also find out that there's this group called the Knights, who are rumored to be the ones behind mixing of the games, and they run the Wired, I guess. I'll be honest. The theme of, the Wired really bleeding into reality is something I think is interesting, but the execution from this episode just didn't quite work for me. There's also a scene, I think it's the end of the episode, when Lane is staring at the men in black outside her house, and she breaks their scouters by using some kind of psychic power. It really felt out of place from the show I've been watching thus far, I'm not gonna lie. What I thought really did work from the episode, though, were Lane's parents. The episode starts with a narration about how parents aren't needed, and it's kind of like a dying concept. And we see Lane's dad watching her as she starts putting her new computer together. Mika starts talking to them about how Lane is changing, and her two parents are quick to dismiss that. But once Mika is out of earshot, then they very briefly discuss that no, she's right. Something is going on with Lane, and it's not a good thing. It's subtle, but I, as the audience, can definitely see that they're right. Not necessarily that it's a bad thing, but that Lane is changing. She's becoming a lot more talkative when she's at school. She's a lot more excitable. We see how good she is with her computer and the upgrades of it. I mean, there's these really great shots of her at her computer where her eyes are just reflecting the screen, and I just really love the look of it. Now, the themes of The Wired crossing over into reality and Lane's evolution in spite of her parents both come to a head at the end of the episode. Her dad sits her down to have a talk about how The Wired is, it's nothing more than a way to share and filter information. It's not something that Lane should really try to get that involved in. And that she mustn't confuse The Wired for the real world. So Lane from the first episode and the majority of the second episode probably would have nodded and said little to nothing in response. But here, she very quickly retorts that the borders between the worlds aren't clear, showing her full intent to explore as much of The Wired as possible and let it influence her character even more. So while I didn't care for the plot of this episode that much, I do think the scenes with Lane's parents worked really well. I think showing how powerless they are when it comes to controlling her due to her growing reputation and skills inside The Wired is just another way of showing that it is bleeding over into reality. It's bleeding into their daughter. And for better or for worse, there's nothing they can do about it.